Blessed people, welcome back to the Daily Scoop. Today's discussion is packed because we have several major conversations happening around dancehall right now. We are talking about Masicka, Skillibeng, Intense, ALKALINE KARTEL, Shensia, and some serious reflection from dancehall veteran Admiral Bailey about how the culture operated during the 90s. And trust me, people, that last part is important because it raises a bigger question, which is, has dancehall lost some of the unity that made the music so powerful in the first place? So let's get straight into it. Starting off with Massacre. People at the time this discussion was being put together, dancehall fans were waiting for the first week numbers for Massacre Forever In album. And naturally, once an artist released a major project, the fans immediately start asking, how much did it sell? Now let's be clear, predicting sales is not the same thing as saying an artist failed. Those are two completely different things. Massacre has built a significant international audience, and Forever Rain generated plenty of discussion before and after its release. There are also several factors that can influence first week numbers. One major factor being discussed is YouTube. When you remove or reduce one of the major platforms that fans traditionally use to consume music, that can have an impact on overall streaming performance. Then you have Spotify, Apple Music, iTunes purchases, and other platforms. And dancehall fans sometimes make the mistake of assuming that because a song is everywhere on social media, the sales must automatically be massive. That is not necessarily how the business works. You can have an artist trending heavily online and still have a different result when the actual numbers come out. And that is why I always say, let the numbers speak. If the numbers come out higher than somebody predicted, excellent. If they are lower, that does not erase the artist's career. Masicka has already established himself as one of the most important voices of modern dancehall. So whatever the first week figure turns out to be, it should be looked at in the context. Now, let's move to something that caught people's attention. Shensia entered the conversation surrounding the tension between Masicka and Skillibeng. And honestly, her reaction was interesting because Shensia has worked with both artists. Think about it. Shensia and Masicka have collaborated on music, including It and Run. Then you have Skillibeng, and Shensia is also connected to one of the biggest international record associated with the newer dancehall movement, Shake It to the Max. So when Shensia essentially questioned why her husband and her baby daddy were fighting, fans immediately understood that she was jokingly referring to two artists she rates highly. And this is where the situation gets interesting. Because while fans might want to see Masicka and Skillibeng trade lyrical shots, the artists themselves don't necessarily have to take the same position. Sometimes fans want a clash more than the artists do, and that's something people have to understand. Dancehall is competitive. Clashing is part of the culture, but every disagreement does not always have to become a full-scale war. If Masicka and Skillibeng eventually decide to compete lyrically, that is their choice. But if they decide they would rather focus on music business and international growth, that's also their choice. And Shensia's reaction basically reminds us that there are people in the industry who would rather see collaboration than unnecessary conflict. Now let's get into one of the biggest conversation. Intense. Recently, Intense created discussion after releasing music that many listeners interpreted as containing shots at other artists. And one of the names that became part of the conversation was Skillibeng. But it did not stop there, because once Intense entered that space, people started connecting his words to VYBZ KARTEL, ALKALINE, and even Masicka. This is where dancehall becomes fascinating, because in Jamaica, once an artist says something that sounds like a subliminal, the audience immediately start decoding it. People are asking, who is he talking about? Was that line directed at Skillibeng? Was that about Massacre? Was it connected to Cartel? Was it an alkaline reference? And sometimes the artist never confirms anything, but the fans have already created an entire storyline. No, Vibes Machine has offered his own perspective on the situation. According to his argument, a lot of today's dancehall movements still somehow lead back to Vibes Cartel. Whether somebody is supporting Cartel, whether somebody is criticizing Cartel, whether somebody is distancing themselves from Cartel, or whether somebody is trying to establish themselves as the opposite of Cartel, the name still comes up, and that brings us to Alkaline. One of the most interesting argumentaries was about Alkaline. The point being made is that Alkaline took a different approach when he emerged. Instead of building his career around constantly calling Vybz Kartel name, Alkaline developed his own identity. The Vendetta movement became recognizable, the visual presentation was different, the music was different, the branding was different, and most importantly, Alkaline became a major artist without needing to make Vybz Kartel the centerpiece of every conversation. Now, whether you are a Gaza supporter, Vendetta supporter, or simply a dancehall fan, you have to acknowledge that Alkaline built a significant career. That's a controversial statement. It is simply part of the history of modern dancehall. And this is where the argument becomes important for younger artists. If you want to become a superstar, you can't spend your entire career explaining another superstar. At some point, people need you to know your music, your identity, your version, your catalog, your achievement. That is why Alkaline career strategy continues to be discussed. Then we have Massacre, and Massacre Journey is another interesting example. There was a period when people strongly associated Massacre with opposition to the Gaza movement and Vybz Kartel. That became part of the narrative surrounding his rise. But Massacre's career eventually grew beyond that. He developed an international sound, he collaborated with major artists, he released albums, he built an audience outside Jamaica, and he became known for his own musical identity. So when people say that an artist can benefit from being connected to a major rivalry, there may be some truth to that from a publicity perspective, but that cannot carry an artist forever. Eventually, the music has to stand on its own, and Massacre has reached a point where his catalog has to be judged independently of any other old rivalry. Now, here is the question I want you to answer in the comments. Is Vybz Kartel still the center of modern dancehall? Because if you listen to some of the conversation happening online, it is almost seems impossible to discuss the current generation without eventually mentioning Cartel. But there is another way of looking at it. Maybe it is not that Cartel control modern dancehall. Maybe it's simple that his influence is so significant that artists from different generations are still being compared to the standard he established. Those are two very different things, and we have to separate influence from control. Vybz Kartel has a huge legacy, but modern dancehall has many other major artists. You have Alkaline Massacre, Skillibeng, Shensia Spice, Popcorn, Chronic Law, Intense, and many others. So rather than saying one person owns the entire culture, perhaps we should recognize that dancehall has multiple generations and multiple movements happening simultaneously. Now, people, this is the part I found especially interesting. Veteran artist Admiral Bailey recently reflected on the old school dancehall environment and spoke about the famous Harrow's recording studio era. And if you love dancehall history, you need to pay attention to this, because according to Bailey recollection, Harrow's was not simply a place where artists went to record songs. It became a meeting point. Artists from different backgrounds could interact, they could debate, they could compete, they could share ideas, and they could help one another. And that environment contributed to the development of some of the music that people still celebrate today. Think about some of the names associated with that generation. You have Shaggy, Elephant Man, Baby Sham, Bushman, Merciless, Fabulous, and a lot more. Producers and entertainers passed through those circles. According to Bailey recollection, the atmosphere created opportunities for artists to learn from one another. That is something the modern industry could learn from. One of the most powerful points in Bailey's story was that many of these artists were not stars when they first met. They were developing, they were hungry, they were trying to find their sound, they were trying to get a break. And because everybody was coming from a similar position, there was a stronger sense of togetherness. Bailey described an environment where artists could sit together, share food, talk about music, and help each other. That does not mean everything was perfect. There were disagreements, there were rivalries, there were problems, but there was still a sense that everybody was part of one larger community. And that is what Bailey believed changed over time. As artists become successful, wealthy, and internationally recognized, the environment changed. People became more separated. Everybody had their own crew, their own studio, their own management, their own business interests, and suddenly the communal environment was not as strong. Bailey's story also touched on how changes around Arrow eventually contributed to artists moving elsewhere and building new spaces. Eventually, different groups began operating independently. Artists spread out, some moved toward other studios and different production teams. The old gathering place no longer had the same function, and that is where Bailey made a very important observation. He basically argued that you can't simply recreate the 90s by copying the sound because the sound was connected to the environment. The relationship mattered, the friendship mattered, the competition mattered, the football matches mattered, the everyday interaction mattered. The artists were seeing each other regularly, they were communicating, they were learning, they were competing, they were building together. And when that disappeared, something disappeared from the dancehall as well. So people, today we covered a lot. We look at Masicka Forever Rain and the conversation about first week sales. We look at Shensia's reaction to the Masicka and Skillibeng situation. We talk about Intense, Skillibeng, Alkaline Massacre and the continuing influence of VYBZ Kartel. And then we went all the way back in the 90s with Admiral Bailey, who gave us an important history lesson about Arrow Studio, community football collaboration, and the relationship that helped shape an entire generation of Jamaican music. So, I want to hear from you. Do you think modern dancehall has lost some of that togetherness? And when it comes to VYBZ Kartel, Alkaline, Massacre, Skillibeng, and Intense, do you think too many conversations still revolve around old rivalries? Drop your honest opinion in the comments. Just remember, debate the music, respect the people, and keep the conversation going. Until the next one, bless up, stay safe, and keep supporting dancehall.